The dark truth behind the Secret Santa Slayer. A gift with a deadly twist. Hook. Imagine receiving a gift that could change your life or end it. What happens when a seemingly innocent Secret Santa turns into something much darker? Stay with us as we uncover the terrifying twist in the Secret Santa Slayer. Don't blink, because once you start watching, there's no turning back. This is a story you won't be able to forget. Watch till the end if you dare. The office was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that fills the space with tension. Outside, snowflakes danced through the window. Inside, the air was thick with unease. Lily sat at her desk, eyes glued to the computer screen. She hadn't noticed it at first. A small envelope. It sat on her chair, waiting. Her breath caught when she saw it. No one had come near her desk. She had been the last to leave the party last night. The office Christmas party. Everyone had drawn names for Secret Santa. A silly tradition. But there was something off about this envelope. The handwriting was unfamiliar. The letters jagged. Her pulse quickened as she picked it up. The paper felt colder than it should. Inside, there was a single note. It read, "You're next." Her heart skipped. What did it mean? The room seemed to close in around her. The soft hum of the fluorescent lights felt distant now. Her breath grew shallow. She glanced around, half expecting someone to jump out and laugh. But the office remained still, empty, lonely. Her eyes flitted to the clock on the wall. Almost 9 a.m. She wasn't alone, but it felt like it. Footsteps echoed from the hallway. Distant, but they were getting closer. Lily froze. Who could it be? She leaned forward, eyes darting to the door. No one entered. Yet the footsteps didn't stop. The noise continued, closer now, louder. Her chair creaked under her, though she hadn't moved. A shiver crawled down her spine. The door opened without a sound. Lily's breath hitched. A figure stood in the doorway, a figure wearing a Santa hat. The silence in the room deepened. The figure didn't move. Lily stood slowly, trembling. The figure's eyes locked onto hers, and then it grinned. The grin stretched unnaturally wide. The air grew thick, suffocating. Suddenly, she realized. The note wasn't a prank. The Secret Santa Slayer had arrived. Lily's heart hammered in her chest. She stepped back, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, smiling. That awful, wide grin. The room felt colder now. Her breath came out in shallow gasps. The figure's eyes never left her. It was as if they could see through her, into her soul. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Her body felt like stone, frozen in place. The figure finally stepped forward. One slow, deliberate step, then another. Lily's legs trembled. She wanted to scream, but she couldn't. Her throat tightened. The figure raised a hand. Lily's eyes followed the movement. It was holding something, a small, shiny knife. The blade gleamed under the harsh office lights. Lily's blood ran cold. "Dubbers, what do you want?" she managed to whisper. The figure didn't answer. It just tilted its head, still grinning. Lily's pulse pounded in her ears. Her gaze flickered to the door. Could she make it? The figure took another step closer. Lily's body screamed for movement, for escape, but she couldn't move. Her feet felt glued to the floor. The figure was almost there. Closer, closer. She could feel the chill radiating from it. A soft breath of wind passed by her face. The figure's breath didn't smell like anything. It was like a void. Lily, a voice rasped. It was her name. But it wasn't a voice she recognized. It was cold, hollow, lifeless. Lily, the voice repeated. The knife glinted in the figure's hand. Lily's throat constricted. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the office. The figure stiffened. Lily's head snapped to the door. A coworker burst in, wide-eyed. "Lily, what's going on?" The figure vanished in an instant, as if it had never been there. The room was silent again, but the air felt heavier now. The note. The envelope. Lily clutched it in her hand, her fingers trembling. She stared at the empty doorway. The footsteps were still there, but now they were all too real. The Secret Santa slayer hadn't gone. Not yet. Lily's hands shook as she dropped the envelope onto her desk. Her coworker, Tom, rushed to her side. "Lily, are you okay?" he asked, his voice frantic. She nodded, but the words wouldn't come. She couldn't explain what she had just seen. Her mind raced. Had she imagined it? The cold air, the figure, the knife? Tom scanned the room, eyes wide. There was no sign of anyone, no trace of the figure. "No one was there," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Tom frowned. "You sure?" She nodded again, but doubt gnawed at her. How could it have just vanished? The silence in the room grew heavy. Tom, still uneasy, looked at her. "You were alone when you came in, right? You haven't seen anyone else?" Lily shook her head. I don't know. I think I was alone." Her voice cracked. A cold shiver ran down her spine. She glanced back at the door. "Nothing. Maybe you're just exhausted." "It was a long night at the party," Tom suggested, his voice softer now. But the unease in his eyes told her he wasn't convinced either. Lily felt the weight of his stare. She looked back at the desk. The envelope was gone. It had disappeared, just like the figure. Her heart pounded again, this time in confusion. Tom followed her gaze. "What the? Where'd it go?" She jumped when the phone rang, its sudden shrillness slicing through the tension. Tom answered it, still looking around the room. Lily froze as she listened. The voice on the other end was muffled, distorted, like it was being whispered through a layer of cloth. Tom's face paled. Lily's breath caught. "Tom," she whispered. He held up a hand to silence her. The voice on the phone continued. "Lily, it's time. You didn't listen." Tom's eyes widened. Then he slammed the phone down. The room felt smaller, darker. Something was wrong. The air shifted. Lily's mind raced. Her gaze darted to the clock on the wall. It was still early, too early for things to feel so wrong. Then the door clicked open again. This time there was no figure, but the air turned frigid. And once again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway. That Lily's pulse quickened. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Her eyes snapped to Tom. His face had gone ashen. He looked at her, his eyes wide with fear. "It's happening again, isn't it?" he whispered. Lily nodded, unable to speak. The footsteps were almost at the door now. She could hear the faint scraping of shoes against the floor, but no one entered. The silence that followed was suffocating. Lily felt her skin prickle, cold dread crawling down her spine. Tom stepped back, his hand hovering over the door handle, but he didn't open it. A soft voice, barely a whisper, drifted into the room. "Lily." It was the same voice, distorted and hollow. Her heart raced. Her breath came faster. "Lily, it's too late." Tom's hand shook. He opened the door, just a crack, peering out. Nothing. The hallway was empty. The footsteps had stopped. Lily's legs trembled. She didn't want to look back, but something pulled her gaze to the window. She froze. Outside, the snow had stopped. But in the reflection, she saw something moving. A shadow. Tall. Unnatural. She whipped her head around. The reflection was gone. Her eyes scanned the room again. There was no one, but something still felt wrong, like she was being watched. Her mind was racing. She had to get out. Her fingers brushed the envelope again, the one that had disappeared earlier. But now it was back, sitting on her desk. She didn't remember putting it there. A chill crawled down her neck. "Tom," she whispered, voice trembling. He turned, eyes still wide with unease. "Something isn't right. I don't think it's over." Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them. The force rattled the windows. Lily gasped, spinning to face it. The office had gone pitch black. No lights, no sound, only darkness. Then she heard it, a low, rasping laugh. It echoed through the void. From every direction, the Secret Santa Slayer was here. And this time, there would be no escape. That Lily's breath caught in her throat. The laugh reverberated in the darkness, twisted and cruel. Tom's hand reached for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The handle turned, but the door remained locked. Lily could hear the sound of her own heartbeat in her ears. Thump, thump, thump. The air around them grew colder. It wasn't just the temperature. It felt like the room itself had turned to ice. The laugh continued, but it was different now. It wasn't coming from one place. It was all around them, in every corner of the room, from above, below. Lily's body trembled, as if every fiber of her being was on edge. She backed away from the door, eyes wide. Her mind was racing. What was happening? Where had it come from? The office, the room, felt as if it was closing in on them. She could barely make out Tom's silhouette in the dark. His voice was strained, panicked. "Lily, we need to get out." "I can't," she gasped. The laugh grew louder, closer. It surrounded them, pressing in. Suddenly, the lights flickered on. Not the usual hum of office lights. These were cold, flickering, like dying flames. And the figure stood there again. The same Santa hat. The same wide, twisted grin. It was closer this time. Too close. Lily froze, unable to move. Her throat was tight. Tom's breath was shallow beside her. The figure didn't speak. It didn't need to. It raised its hand. The blade glinted, shimmering in the dim light. The cold air intensified as it took a step forward. Lily stumbled back, almost falling. Tom grabbed her arm, trying to pull her away, but the figure was too fast. It reached out, its fingers brushing the sleeve of her shirt. The contact was like ice, seeping into her skin. A jolt of terror shot through her. "Run!" she screamed at Tom, her voice hoarse. Without thinking, they both bolted for the door. But it wouldn't open. It was as if the room itself was holding them captive. The figure's laugh echoed louder now. It was right behind them. They could feel its presence, feel the coldness of its breath. Tom turned, eyes wild. "We're trapped," he shouted. Lily's mind raced. There had to be a way out. Suddenly, she heard a faint sound. A voice, whispering, "Don't go, it's too late." Lily spun around. The figure was gone, but its presence lingered. The room fell silent again. The lights flickered out, and in that silence, there was only the whisper. Next, the whisper lingered in the dark, like a shadow creeping closer. Lily's skin crawled. Her breath was shallow. Tom's grip on her arm tightened. He looked around, panicked. "There's nothing here. It's gone. It's gone." But Lily wasn't sure. She wasn't convinced. The air was still too cold, too still. A shiver ran down her spine. Then, a sharp sound broke the silence. A soft thud. It came from behind them. They both whipped around. Nothing. Only the empty office. The door still locked. Lily's eyes scanned the room. The envelope. It was back again, sitting on the desk, untouched. How? She hadn't put it there. Her pulse quickened. Tom was trembling beside her. The lights flickered again. Flicker. Flicker. Then they went out entirely. The darkness swallowed them whole. Lily's breath was the only sound in the room. A soft rasp in the suffocating quiet. And then she heard it. The sound of footsteps. Slow. Measured. Getting closer. Her body tensed. It couldn't be real. Not again. Tom's voice was barely a whisper. "Lily, do you hear that?" She nodded. Her throat was tight, suffocating. The footsteps stopped, but they weren't alone. A cold gust of wind swept through the room. It carried with it the smell of something rotten. Lily choked on the stench. Her eyes darted around the darkness. The footsteps were right there, right behind them. Tom spun around, eyes wide with terror. But there was nothing, except the oppressive feeling that something was there. Something unseen. The whisper returned, low, haunting. "You're too late." Lily's heart stopped. Her eyes locked on the empty space. And then, without warning, hands reached out from the darkness. Cold, skeletal hands. They grabbed her, pulling her into the shadows. Tom screamed, but it was too late. Lily's scream was drowned out by the darkness. She fought, her arms flailing, but she couldn't break free. The cold hands tightened. Her vision blurred. The last thing she saw was the twisted grin of the figure. And then everything went black. The darkness was suffocating. Lily's chest tightened as she struggled to breathe. The cold hands didn't let go. They pulled her deeper into the black void. Her limbs were heavy, useless. Every inch of her body screamed to escape, but she was trapped. Then the cold voice came again. Too late. The words whispered across her skin, like an icy breath. Lily's heart pounded in her ears. Where was Tom? Had he been taken too? Her mind raced, but the fear consumed her. She couldn't see, couldn't move. Just the weight of the darkness pressing in from all sides. Suddenly, she felt the hands release their grip. She fell, not to the floor, but to something softer. Something that felt wrong. Too soft, too warm. Her eyes snapped open. She was lying on the floor of the office again. The lights flickered back on, dim and buzzing. The room looked normal, but it wasn't. The envelope sat on the desk once more, its edges crisp and fresh. No signs of anything strange. Lily sat up, heart racing. Her surroundings looked the same, but everything felt different. A whisper brushed her ear, soft and menacing. "Are you ready for your gift?" Lily's throat constricted. She spun around. No one was there. She was alone, or so it seemed. She stood shakily, hands trembling. Every nerve in her body screamed to leave, but the door remained locked. She went to the desk, almost in a trance. The envelope, the handwriting, it was the same. The words inside were simple, yet they chilled her to the core. "It's time for you to give your gift." Her fingers shook as she turned the paper over. In the corner of the note, there was a symbol she hadn't noticed before. A red streak, a smear of blood. Her breath caught. The room suddenly felt smaller. The air thickened with an oppressive weight. She glanced back at the door. The footsteps were returning. Slow, measured, closer. Lily's blood ran cold. There was no escape, no way out. She wasn't in control anymore. The figure was coming for her again. And this time, there was no one to save her. The footsteps grew louder, clearer. Each step reverberated in the room, filling the air with a heavy tension. Lily's heart hammered in her chest. Her breath came in shallow gasps. She couldn't move. Her body was paralyzed with fear. The footsteps reached the door, and then silence. The room seemed to hold its breath. Lily's gaze flickered to the envelope, her only anchor in the chaos. The bloodstain on the corner of the paper pulsed, as if alive. A sudden cold washed over her, making her shiver uncontrollably. The door creaked open. A shadow stretched across the floor, stretching towards her like a dark, clawed hand. She couldn't look away. There, in the doorway, stood the figure. It was different now, darker, more solid. The twisted grin was wider. The eyes glinted with an unnatural light. It stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. Lily could feel her pulse in her throat. The figure's hand moved up, slowly reaching for something. The knife. It glinted in the harsh office light. The figure didn't speak. It didn't need to. The blade gleamed as it was raised. Her body shook as if it were being pulled by invisible strings. But there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. She was trapped. The figure took another step, its presence overwhelming. Lily's legs were too weak to move. Her mouth opened, but no sound escaped. The air seemed to thicken, as if the very room was alive with dread. Then a voice, a familiar voice, whispered in her ear. "Lily, you were never meant to escape." The voice was soft, yet full of malice. It was close, so close. It wasn't coming from the figure. It was inside her mind. Her eyes widened in terror as the figure closed in. The knife hovered above her. Closer, closer. And just when she thought she couldn't take it any longer, the door slammed shut again. The figure vanished. The room fell silent. Lily didn't move. Her body was numb with fear. The knife, the presence, the whisper, it was all gone. But something remained. The air was thick, still suffocating, as if the darkness had become part of her. And then she saw it on the floor in front of her, a small, wrapped gift. It wasn't there before. It hadn't been there when she had glanced earlier. Lily's stomach twisted. The gift sat there untouched. But it wasn't just any gift. It had her name written on it, in the same jagged, twisted handwriting. She reached for it, her fingers trembling, and as she lifted the small box, she knew, deep down, that it was her turn now. The Secret Santa Slayer hadn't finished with her yet. She was the next gift. Lily's fingers shook as she held the small box in her hands. The room seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing tighter with each passing second. She could feel her heart racing in her chest, each beat deafening in the silence. The box was so small, so innocent, but there was no way she could open it. Not now, not after everything. But she couldn't just leave it there either. It felt like the room was waiting for her to make a choice. She stared at the box, her breath quick and shallow. It was wrapped in plain paper, the edges crisp and neat. Nothing about it seemed out of place, except the weight it carried. Her name. The jagged handwriting from the note. Lily slowly exhaled, her fingers trembling as she pulled at the ribbon that held the box together. It came off easily, too easily. The paper slid away, revealing a dark red velvet box. Her stomach twisted into a knot. What was inside? The box creaked as she opened it, the sound too loud in the silence of the office. Inside, nestled in the velvet lining, was a single, small object, a tiny ornament, a snowflake. But it wasn't made of glass or plastic. It was carved from bone, a human bone. Lily's breath caught in her throat. The ornament was smooth, but there was something off about it. It was stained red, as if it had been soaked in blood. The chill of it seeped into her fingertips as she held it. Her hands went numb, and then, just as quickly, everything changed. The air grew colder. A shadow crept across the room, dark and slow, like it was waiting for her to react. Her pulse quickened. The lights flickered again once more. She could hear the faint sound of footsteps in the distance. Familiar. The same slow, deliberate steps. Her heart raced as she turned her head toward the door. And there, standing in the threshold, was the figure again. But this time it was different. It wasn't just standing. It was moving. It stepped forward, the sound of its boots scraping across the floor, sending a jolt of terror through her. The knife was in its hand again, glinting under the dim light. And behind it, another figure appeared. And another. They were all wearing the same twisted grin, the same Santa hats. Lily's blood ran cold. They were coming for her. The Secret Santa Slayer wasn't just one person. It was a group. The footsteps grew louder, closer. The shadow moved forward. Lily's breath caught in her throat. She looked down at the bone ornament in her hand, and the whispers began again. This time, they were coming from everywhere. Lily, it was her name, but twisted, deformed. Lily, you're the gift now. Lily's legs were too weak to stand. She couldn't escape. The figures were closing in on her. Their eyes glinted with that same cold light, and she realized as they surrounded her that there was no escape. Not anymore. She was part of their twisted game. A gift to be claimed. Lily's vision blurred, the world around her dissolving into darkness. Her body felt weightless, as if she were floating through an endless void. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. The coldness that had gripped her earlier was gone, replaced by an eerie, suffocating stillness. It was a feeling she had never known before, a feeling of being erased. She felt no pain, no fear, only a strange, oppressive emptiness. Time seemed to stretch on forever, and then she felt it, a pull deep within her chest. Her heart beat erratically, as though trying to break free from an invisible chain. The emptiness began to recede, replaced by something darker, something alive. The ground beneath her shifted. Her feet seemed to touch solid ground for the first time in what felt like ages. Lily opened her eyes, but the darkness remained, thick and impenetrable. She reached out, her hands trembling, and felt something cold and slick under her fingertips. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the silence that pressed in, deafening. A whisper echoed in her mind. "You belong to us now." Lily's breath hitched. The voice was familiar. It was the leader, the one who had taken her. But it wasn't just the leader. It was them, all of them. She wanted to scream, but no sound came. She tried to move, but her body felt heavy, bound by invisible forces. Something shifted in the shadows ahead. She squinted, trying to make out the shape. Slowly, the darkness parted like thick fog, revealing a twisted reflection. A mirror. Lily gasped, her body recoiling as she saw herself staring back. But it wasn't her. Her eyes were black, hollow pits. Her skin was ashen, almost translucent, as if it had been drained of life. The smile that stretched across her face wasn't her own. It was twisted, cruel, and then she heard the laughter, low, guttural. It came from every direction, reverberating off the walls of this dark place she now inhabited. And with it, a terrible realization sank in. She wasn't alone. She was one of them now. The figures had claimed her. The Secret Santa Slayer's game had taken her soul. And now, she would be the one to give the gift. But this gift wasn't something anyone could return. The darkness swirled, growing thicker around her, suffocating her once again. And as it swallowed her whole, the last thing Lily felt was the cold smile that spread across her new face. She had become a part of their endless game. The next gift. And there would be no escape. That Lily's mind raced as she stumbled through the darkened office. Her breath was sharp and shallow, each gasp echoing in the silence. She felt a cold hand graze her shoulder, sending a chill down her spine. She spun around, her heart thudding in her chest. But there was no one there. The empty office seemed to stretch out, endless in its desolation. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead was the only sound, filling the air with an oppressive, unsettling static. Her fingers brushed the back of the desk. The familiar would now foreign and distant. She had meant to end up here, locked in this twisted game. The Secret Santa Slayer wasn't just some urban legend. It was real, and it had claimed her. Lily's hand tightened around the envelope. The note that had started it all was still inside. She had tried to discard it, but it kept returning, like an invitation, a curse. Lily, her breath caught as the voice came again, not from the speakers, but from the shadows, low and mocking. The footsteps returned, slow, deliberate. Lily's pulse quickened. She glanced toward the door. It was locked. The footsteps grew louder, the sound of boots scraping against the floor, coming closer. She stepped back, her back pressed against the desk. Suddenly, the door burst open. The air in the room turned freezing cold. Through the doorway, she saw the figure, no longer just one, but many. Figures in dark coats, their faces hidden beneath the red Santa hats. Their grins were wide, twisted, and then they all spoke at once, their voices echoing in unison. "Lily, it's your turn." A rush of panic surged through her. Her body refused to move. She couldn't breathe. The figure at the front of the group stepped forward, holding the bone ornament. Lily's hands began to tremble. She recognized the ornament now. It wasn't a gift. It was a marker, a sign that she was one of them. The figures closed in. There was no escape. Lily was no longer a participant in the game. She had become the gift. And the Secret Santa Slayer's game would never end. That Lily's breath hitched as the figures closed in around her, their presence suffocating, the air thick with the smell of decay and cold metal. She wanted to scream, to fight, but her body refused to obey. Her hands, still gripping the envelope, felt like they were frozen in place, the edges of the paper digging into her skin. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the twisted smiles of the figures, their eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The room was silent except for the soft rustle of their movement, as if the very space between them was thick with dread. Lily's pulse hammered in her chest, each beat louder than the last. The leader of the figures, the one who had first claimed her, stepped closer, raising the bone ornament high above her head. Her breath caught in her throat. This was it. She was no longer the hunted. She was the gift. The ornament shimmered in the dim light, blood red and jagged. The figure's hand extended toward her. Lily closed her eyes, unable to look any longer, her heart a knot of terror. But the touch never came. Instead, the sound of footsteps faded away. The figures stopped. Lily's heart pounded, confusion flooding her senses. She opened her eyes slowly. The figures were gone. The room was still, silent. It was as if they had never been there at all. Lily blinked, taking in the room around her. Everything was as it should be. The desk, the chair, the cold, flickering lights above. But the weight in her chest remained. A whisper touched her ear, faint but clear. "Congratulations." Lily spun around, but there was no one there. The air was heavy with a presence, lingering like a shadow just out of sight. She glanced down at her hands. The bone ornament had vanished, as had the envelope, but in their place was something else. A small, blood-red ribbon tied around her wrist. The symbol was clear. She had become part of the game. Lily wasn't free. She never would be. The Secret Santa Slayer's game had claimed another soul, and it would continue forever.